Dr. Martin Eaton, please come forward.
Well, thank you all for being here tonight. It is my honor and pleasure today to introduce Africa and World Politics keynote speaker, Dr. Nazim Olawafemi Mimiko. Dr. Mimiko is an admirable scholar with a long history of service in both academia and the public sector. Even before receiving his doctorate in international relations in 1992, Dr. Mimiko was proving himself an excellent instructor for young minds, teaching at Ondo State University and then continuing on to Obafemi Awolowo University and Adekunle Ajasi University. He now serves as the Vice Chancellor of Adekunle Ajasi University, a post he was honored with last year. However, while he was a sterling educator, he also placed his administrative skills at the disposal of these august institutions, working on numerous committees ranging from the coordination of undergraduate education to the modernization of the libraries. Dr. Mimiko has also served during the course of this service to produce academic publications to further his own field of studies. Since 1989, he has produced 54 published works, books, chapters, and articles on vital topics such as democratization, political economy, and globalization. These works include The Global Village, The Korean Economic Phenomenon, and Crises and Contradictions in Nigeria's Democratization Program, 1986 to 1993. One must be impressed at the accomplishments of Dr. Mimiko as a scholar. However, Dr. Mimiko's works extend far beyond the halls of academia. He has served as a consultant on state and local government reform, a trainer for the Center for Democratic Studies, and a member of the transition team for the governors of Ondo State. These positions have seen him take the lessons he teaches in the university and apply them to the governance of his home, a commendable step that is often forgotten. As such, it is my great pleasure to introduce this excellent teacher, administrator, and scholar, Dr. Nazim Olawafemi Mimiko.
Let me say it's my pleasure to be here this evening to give this keynote address. But permit me to introduce to you two people very quickly. Professor Segun Ogungbemi, who came also with me from Adekunle Ajasi University. And of course, my dear wife, Barrister Bosede Mimiko. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to start by noting that 2 years ago precisely, I was invited to be a part of a book project here in the United States on Professor Falola. With the permission of the project coordinators, I chose to speak on a topic that I chose to write on a topic I called Tradition, Governance Challenges, and the Prospects for Change in Africa, which I considered as some of the core themes around which Professor Falola's work has revolved over the years. And when last year the convener, Tony Falola, broached the idea of my giving this year's keynote address, it occurred to me very quickly that several of the issues and the perspectives that I raised in that book project are still very current and relevant. I therefore decided that I was going to share some of these perspectives, some of these views and positions with this distinguished audience. Let me also say that I was privileged to act as the acting vice chancellor of my university in year 2006. And one of the things I decided to do immediately was to put together what I call the University Public Lecture Series. I was privileged to have Professor Tony Falola take the podium as the first speaker in that series. And coincidentally, he chose to speak on the topic, Africa in World Politics, which precisely and coincidentally is the theme of this year's conference. So it became evident to me, if you will, that there is a meeting of mind, as it were, across the Atlantic Ocean on the appropriateness of this year's theme. I must say that I thank the organizers for giving me the platform. I'm going to be speaking to you, to this distinguished audience, on what I call Africa's shrinking space in a new global system, with Laurent Gbagbo as metaphor. And I begin by mentioning that there are two critical perspectives that are easily recognizable in all the work we have done over the years on Africa. The first relishes the idea that Africa was once a great continent which developmental strides prior to its contact with the outside world were at least comparable to, if not indeed broader, and more meaningful than what obtained in other parts of the world. Reference is often made in this school to the organizational capability of the African peoples, their invention in sundry areas of human endeavor, their gallantry at war and the management of violence, and of course their perceived physical strength. Africa is indeed proclaimed as the cradle of humankind and an indispensable resource base that has served all humanity for so many centuries. The second school finds the earlier perspective unnecessarily celebratory, if not outrightly objectionable. It vigorously disputes the idea of a past steep in grandeur for a continent which by some happenstance has come to be to occupy the bottommost rung of the development ladder, and indeed in virtually all areas of human endeavor. One whose fortune has consistently waned in both absolute and comparable times over the centuries. As I'm sure we all know, African states are, for instance, among the poorest in the world. As a matter of fact, 15 of the 20 poorest countries in the world are supposed to be in Africa. Virtually all of the countries on the continent suffer from poor economic growth, frequent food shortages, and declining involvement in international trade. Its position in the international economic system as a supplier of primary products, be you articles of trade, cash crops, human beings that were packaged as slaves, or even now as mineral resources, including hydrocarbon, that position remains as it was centuries ago. The region has also suffered some of the most violent internal wrangling in the world, ranging from long years of political instability, violence, social disintegration, what have you. There are thus 3 million refugees and no less than 18 million internally displaced people spread across the African continent. It is one continent that has become the epicenter of the world's deadly health epidemic, HIV/AIDS, and one of the battlegrounds in the fight against terrorism and international banditry. Its most populous country, as we noted, remains, to all intents and purposes, a standing embarrassment to everybody. It may not be necessary to deploy this platform the platform afforded by this keynote address for a discussion of either of these perspectives. This is not because they lack the prerequisite for a great conversation, but evidently because the two perspectives will seem to have merged and have indeed virtually become one. As one pundit noted, in the organization of society, what Africa presented prior to the 15th century was much better than what obtained in much of Europe. In relation to democratic governance, where Africa would seem to have fallen greatly below global standards today, we had cause in the past to dispute the democracy implantation thesis. As we argued, whereas conventional wisdom would suggest that democracy was implanted in Africa in the colonial era, the evidence presented by several traditional African political systems not only denounces this, but also indicates that the nuances of democratic governance were actually present in several of these pre-colonial African communities. They all virtually existed in a complex but coherent system of relationship in which the monarch, you a male or a female, as the case may be, had to sit in council with his or her high chiefs, and collectively they took decisions on behalf of the collective. No monarch in the Yoruba political system, for instance, would dare permanently alienate his high chiefs. Any of them that did could not last for too long because they were invariably advised or compelled, as the case may be, to commit suicide. As well, the evidence of separation of powers abound, just as the judicial system operated in a neatly woven relationship with the other organs of state also existed. The tragedy of the African political system, however, derives from the fact that the entire process of state formation and institutionalization of democracy that began several years before contact with Europe was not allowed to mature. It was aborted deliberately and blindly by colonialism. And as Olomona noted, it was at the same time that Otto von Bismarck was trying to knock together the different city-states in what became Germany. It was about the same time that Shaka the Zulu was trying to bring together disparate populations in the southern tip of the African continent. But in modern history, Shaka the Zulu is put down as a despicable, brutal villain, whereas Bismarck is celebrated as the man who brought modern Germany together. It does not matter that both were ideological soulmates. Thus, the continent continues to post dismal records of democratic practice, not because of the absence of a liberal political culture on the part of the African, as has been suggested, but because of the implantation therein of a culture of violence and authoritarianism promoted by colonialism. It is also true that at some point in its history, Africa began what would seem to be like a downward slip in its fortune, precisely because of imperialism, which has been the dominant experience of the African peoples from the 14th century and defined most profoundly by unequal trade, slavery, colonialism, and neocolonialism. Standing on these very broad pedestal, this paper interrogates the place of Africa in an ever-changing global system, on the forces undermining its participation in the system and what lies ahead of it therein. For the avoidance of doubt, this author is not faced by sundry stories of splendor, often told by apologists for Africa. It also does not believe that all of Africa's problems are a function of external contact and its fallouts. For there is so much that is wrong with and about Africa today that is traceable to contending internal forces within the continent. The reluctance to pose the development question correctly in Africa and by Africans remains, for me, a major basis of the enduring challenge that the African continent has become to the world. I proposed, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, that this conference should make a difference in this regard by being brutally frank in posing the questions and very forthright in our prognosis. It is needless to add that a discussion of Africa's place in the global political system cannot be conducted outside a robust appreciation of the domestic situation and condition of the African continent. And this is just in line with the theoretical precepts in foreign policy and international relations, because while trends in the wider global system could and indeed influence the direction in which a nation goes in the global system, it is invariably its domestic realities that define the parameters of its options, its inactions, and what it chooses to do or not do in the international system. It is in this context that Michael Brecher will talk about the external, the internal, and the psychological environments of foreign policy. And while all of these cohere to give meaning to a nation's pattern of behavior in the international system, it is to the internal environment that analysts must turn for an appreciation of what values and ideas a nation projects in the international system. Following from this is the settled thesis that the place of a nation in the international system is essentially determined by its power profile at any point in time. Again, as we noted, while the power equation tends to change from time to time, the fact of the dominance of the powerful over the global system is an abiding fact that has defined the nature of the international system, in all ages and in all climes. These issues are expected to pop up continually in the attempt to situate Africa's place in the global system at this very important conference. I ask the question, is Africa's place really shrinking in the international system? The stories of the dwindling fortune and shrinking space for Africa in the global system are fairly well known and generally well told. A comparative study of the economies of Africa and what used to be its contemporaries, Asia and Latin America, more than anything else, gives expression to this. I give an example. As at 1961, Nigeria was far ahead of South Korea in terms of gross domestic product, gross national production. But today, South Korea has become one of the leading 20 economies of the world. Nigeria still aspires to be in that category in year 2020. In the same vein, a comparison between what Africa was in the early years of relative political independence, both economically and socially, and what it is today, depicts the situation of degeneration. I do not intend to bore you, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, with the details of all of these. The critical question to ask is, what are the forces responsible for the shrinking space for Africa in the international system? And perhaps we should be interested in how Africa found itself in this situation. There are both historical and contemporary explanations for this. Its history of unequal exchange, slavery, colonialism, all laid the foundation of the crisis that define Africa today. It may sound like an obsession with the obvious, but I'm often intrigued when people tend to query what to them seems like too much premium that we place on slavery and colonialism in the subsequent trajectory of development, or lack of it, that has defined the African subsistence today. It is good that scholars like Rodney had addressed this issue, but the point cannot be overemphasized that denunciation of colonialism and slavery are not the mere pastimes of prodigies in the blame game. Rather, they are an acknowledgement that the social consequences of 400 years of slavery and about 100 years of direct colonialism cannot be wished away just like that in the life of the African continent. What Africa got was not only patently disruptive of what it had, but perhaps more importantly, the state structure it got handed over to it was obviously structured to fail. And the example I usually give is that of federalism in relation to several of the countries on the continent, particularly Nigeria. It's a basic and settled thought in federalism that you do not have a federating arrangement in which one unit is in a position to hold a veto over others. Unfortunately, that's precisely what Britain handed over to Nigeria in 1960, evidencing the fact that those arrangements were put in place to fail. Attempts to compare the American experience in colonialism and Africa's also betray a limited appreciation of history. For whereas the New World received the best in materials and in men and women from across the continent of Europe, and of course from the colonies of Africa, Africa was a victim of massive despoliation. The social fabric of the continent was completely devastated and a new culture of violence was implanted. Traditional African systems of conflict resolution were destroyed, and in their places, nothing was given. The democratic process, rudimentary as it was, but with great potentials as accompanies every human institution, was brutally uprooted, as we noted earlier on. It was nurtured and weaned. It was brutally uprooted and replaced by authoritarianism. A new crop of elites was created, nurtured and weaned on the altar of violence. It was armed with structures of the modern state to continue to carry out the art and act of subjugation of the mass of the people in the service of colonialism. What is true of the immediate post-colonial leaders of Africa, I venture to say, is also true of the Martian wing of the ruling elite, which suddenly found that its own trade, that is the management of violence, had become so relevant in the politics of Africa, and they therefore did not waste time in taking over. The attendant command orientation of the military was again passed on to the larger society and became another layer in the process of substitution of a political culture of clear, if rudimentary, democratic practice for authoritarianism. But beyond the fact of colonialism, or more appropriately as a consequence of it, new variables have emerged that define the nature of the crisis of governance that Africa presents today. Among these are the pattern of state organization and the governorship structures and institutions. The predominant model of state organization in post-independence Africa, in spite of the more recent scramble for democratization, remains essentially state authoritarianism. Its protagonists will argue that given the disparate nature of the ethnic configuration in each of the social formations that you have in Africa, that the service of a strong state was required to knock together these pockets of loyalties into a single whole, thus facilitating the process and the purpose of nation building. Conventional wisdom amongst Africans and Africa's early political elites was that it would take a strong, dominant state to rein in the multitude of objectively determined social identities and differentiations that characterize the continent. This, rather than an exploration of their mobilizational possibilities for positive ends, therefore became the central purpose of the African state. This model was in conformity with the preference of the immediate post-colonial African leadership for the privatization of the state, the personalization of power, and by logical extension, the criminalization of dissent. They sought legitimacy for this basically authoritarian model by creating the impression of the need for a distinctively African orientation to development. This was to be delivered through pseudo-ideologies like democratic socialism, African socialism, negritude, Ujamaa, Uhuru, Africa Renaissance, many of which turned out to be hurriedly packaged and largely pedestrian. One major outcome of this was the undermining of civic capacity on the African continent, that is, the legal capacity of the populace to engage in diverse collective action, and the blossoming of constitutional concentration, that is, the tendency to concentrate power in the hands of one or very few persons. And being at variance with the relatively broad base of the decolonization struggle, which threw these leaders up in the first instance, the emergent model was decidedly demobilizational and therefore inappropriate for the aspirations of development of the African peoples. It therefore, understandably, constitutes one critical factor in the non-performance of the African economy, predicated, as it were, on this type of alienation. As well, it made subnational mobilization inevitable in a context in which the state and its custodians continually constrain the space for political action at the micro level. The phenomenon of the failed state, in which the state simply finds it impossible to govern, that has characterized the African state system today, especially since the implosion of communism, is at once a consequence and a betrayal of the hollowness of the authoritarian state model that has become so popular in Africa. The attempt by Madami to deconstruct the character of the collapsing African state as essentially that which remains of the colonial state in Africa does not detract from this reality of institutional decay, especially in the absence of their substitution with a more advanced institutional structure. From Somalia, Zaire, through Liberia and Sierra Leone, and now to Côte d'Ivoire and the Maghreb, the authoritarian state model simply refused to give a credible account of itself as a response to the pull by the centripetal forces. Indeed, it would be correct to surmise that the crisis of the African political economy these past years, defined by ethnic conflict, political inefficiency, administrative weaknesses, corruption, and economic stagnation, can be understood in part as caused by attempts over the past decades to impose high level of authoritarianism in contemporary African states. In the circumstances, it is not a surprise that Africa wasn't really capable of standing up to be counted on the direction of global politics over the years. The internal vagaries were not held by the Cold War, which effectively turned Africa into a theater of ideological warfare, with many of the states on the continent fighting proxy wars on behalf of the fading powers. The collapse of the Cold War and the attenuation of the bogeyman of communism again dramatically undercut Africa's importance in the reckoning of those who held the levers of power in the global political system. The continent receded in strategic importance and value and became a completely marginalized space. And rather than help, globalization would seem to have further weakened Africa and further constrained the space in the global system. Joseph Stiglitz' work on globalization and its discontent broadly represents the dominant pattern of critical interrogation of the phenomena of globalization in the literature, including the limited choices of the newer economies in the face of its surge and in the context of debilitating challenges and negative externalities it imposes on these economies. A prognosis followed this broad outline, compelling the conclusion that the only option open to the newer social formations in the face of globalization realities is proper positioning and collective engagement in the global economy, against which very strong currents they cannot hope to swim as individual entities. It is to be noted, however, that there is a dimension of the phenomenon of globalization that remains under-researched. It is globalization's unexpected outcomes for its promoters, which also deserve to be interrogated in a conference of this nature. These are economies that put together the structure and workings of the global political economy in the last century and have passionately defended the same ever since. We must interrogate the nature of such unexpected outcomes, the forces that propelled and are sustaining them, and the implications thereof on the leading economies of the world in particular and international political economy in general. Phenomena like the recent global financial meltdown, outsourcing, migration, forms of trade relations and financial holdings that threaten to disrupt the prevailing economy power equation, variants of protectionism, transborder crime, food crisis, climate change, and the globalization of unwanted cultural forms like polygamy in Texas or hijab in France and Australia, in the context of a core orientation of globalization, which is about harmonization on the basis of Western liberal values, may not exactly be consistent with the expectations and objectives of the key promoters of globalization. These are outcomes of globalization against which the owners of globalization do not seem as yet to have an answer. Do they in any way provide fresh opportunities for the countries on the African continent? I argue that acute over-centralization of power remains a key factor in Africa's instability. The nature of the political system Africa got handed to it was a winner-takes-all, zero-sum type of system. It is either you win or you lose completely. There doesn't seem to be a middle way anywhere. And in the plural setting that we have in Africa, that type of arrangement is the very recipe for crisis and conflict. Adept at the game of power, African leaders quickly moved to centralize power They declared opposition as enmity, good enough only for destruction, and moved to illegitimize competition for power. A quick survey of the African political terrain will clearly show how this has played out from one country to another. The desire to sustain a decrepit state structure for the purpose of rent-seeking is also a factor in the emergent instability in Africa. The dominance of the state was a principal feature of the new post-colonial state on the continent. But rather than being developmental like its Asian counterparts, the African state chose to be predatory. It therefore became a factor in the demobilization of the African population and the process of de-development by which the continent has become defined. Ethnic suspicions, issues of who dominates, who is to be dominated, detract from the needed task of political reform, defined as opening up of the democratic space. The point has been made that there is nothing inherently conflictual about ethnic or religious plurality. The problem arises when such variables are activated for political ends. Ethnic diversity then quickly becomes ethnicity, and religious plurality becomes religiosity, both of which are profoundly damaging to new states, as the examples of countries like Algeria, Lebanon, and sundry African nations which had had to contend with violent ethnic or religious warfare will indicate. Obvious lack of understanding of the nuances of democracy and democratic governance on the part of the leaders also plays a key role in Africa's instability, either because of their private interests, which they often place above corporate interests, or because of their rather limited exposure. African leaders as yet have not given an indication that they understand the full implications of democratic governance. Indeed, what the contemporary history of Africa has revealed is that the so-called common people are far ahead of their leaders in terms of their commitment to democracy and in its more obvious forms, including democratic elections. As well, the lackluster support for Africa's genuine democratic aspirations by the international system detracts from the goals of democratization. The international system concedes essentially only those things from which Africa can hardly benefit by the reason of the realities of its political economy. Example is that it's a congenially weak economy with lack of productive capacity and therefore can hardly take advantage of the African Growth and Opportunities Act. The continent lacks the capacity to compete in a globalizing system with or without the WTO, and cannot act alone in the quest for reparation of proceeds of corruption from European banks. There is the policies of exclusion everywhere, a direct failure factor of most of the governance systems you had in place. It has come in different forms. In Côte d'Ivoire, it came as ovuarite. In Nigeria, the commitment to preventing former Vice President Atiku Abubakar from becoming president became virtually an ideology of governance, the directive principle of state policy, as it were. In Somalia, Said Barre transcended the level of nationality, where there was not much for him to invoke, and went to the level of playing one clan against another in an entirely nationally homogeneous entity. In Liberia, it was the conflict between the Americo-Liberians and the indigenous Liberians. The net effect of all of these processes has been the entrenchment of a vicious circle in which economic decline, reduced capacity, and poor governance reinforce each other, thereby confirming Africa's peripheral and diminishing role in the world economy. Thus, over the centuries, Africa has become and remains the marginalized continent. I stand to be corrected, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, that such a profile presented by Africa is deserving of a veto vote in the United Nations Security Council. For the original purpose of the veto vote was to enable the victorious emergent great powers which bore the brunt of World War II to take charge of the global system with a view to determine the nature of the peace, the post-war peace that the global system needed. It therefore goes without saying that it is the preserve of the powerful, a status which Africa is yet to truly attain. The question for countries like Nigeria and others that are angling for the security vote, the veto vote in the Security Council, is what do they want to do with the vote? Perhaps to be able to vote for a no-fly zone resolution, the implications of which they hardly understand, and the direction of implementation over which they have no say whatsoever. I asked the question, what is to be done? I acknowledge that some great strides may have been made on the good governance path in Africa, especially since Samuel Huntington's third wave commenced at the close of the 1990s. But the overall record is not only dismal, but the logical conclusion following from observable trends is indeed scary. Look at Côte d'Ivoire. The destruction of a once widely acknowledged basin of stability and economic development was a function of a combination of centralization of power and politics of exclusion. While Felix Houphouët-Boigny would not agree to share or devolve power, in spite of his Pan-African orientation, his successors, Henry Bedi, General Robert Gay, perfected the art of exclusion via the concept of variety. It is significant that after 10 years in office, 5 of which were actually unearned or illegitimate, President Gbagbo has refused to hand over power after an election which he was virtually compelled to hold, and which, in the estimation of most reasonable people and organizations, he clearly lost. That speaks to the African big men, who, in utter disregard of the consequences of their actions on their nations, would rather remain in office and bring misfortune upon their nations rather than quit. Look at what is happening in the Maghreb today and what Libya has become after 42 years of governance by Muammar Gaddafi. The tragedy of the Libyan situation, whether we like it or not, is that Muammar Gaddafi, perhaps more than any other leader on the African continent, actually put the Libyan state at the service of the Libyan people. But again, how do you justify an individual remaining in office for all of 42 years? And now, he has brought his own country, by reason of his desire to remain in office in perpetuity, he has brought his own country probably to the state where it was in 1969 when he took over power. That is the insensitivity of the African leadership that we must talk about at a conference of this nature. These are what the Laurent Gbagbo phenomenon evidences most pointedly for the African continent. It is not just a manifestation of the failure of the African authoritarian state model to rein in objectively determined social identities, some of which actually overlap. It also underscores the point that the key challenge to democracy and development and effective participation in the global system for Africa is more than anything else the leadership of the continent. The picture looks so bleak everywhere we turn, yet there does not seem to be an alternative to democracy and good governance if Africa must be reckoned with in the global system. While it may not be the only one, democracy is evidently a necessary prerequisite for the development and, by implication, credible participation in global politics for Africa. The critical issue in Africa is still the mismanagement of power and long-standing iniquitous power relations. It is a proposition that the nature of the abuse of the past that Africa went through was such that has greatly blunted its vision for democracy and paralyzed its internal capacity to reinvent. Yet Africa cannot do without democracy, not because of some good governance conditionality prescriptions of aid agencies, but because of our persuasion that while democracy may not solve all of Africa's problems, none of its major problems is going to get solved without democracy. It would therefore seem, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, that building and sustaining democratic structures is one area, perhaps more than aid and mosquito nets, on which Africa needs international support. The truth is that the African peoples need to be protected against their rampaging ruling elites. An agglomeration of the abuse that African peoples had been subjected to by their governments these past 50 years or so of relative political independence qualifies to be termed a world war in terms of its magnitude of destruction. It would seem that the leadership is so sadistic that it possesses and revels in an infinite capacity to inflict injury on its hapless citizens. Governments that were set up to protect the people have often found reasons to turn their guns on them, as state violence has become the dominant pattern of managing genuine feelings of indignation and protest on the part of the people. There's therefore the need for freedom from fear and want for African populations, two key issues of human security that have paralyzed their communities for so long. Even so, it is true Africa has been able to move away, if only marginally, from the crisis-infested years of the 1990s and the wasted decade of the 1980s. There has not been any large-scale and complete breakdown of state structures since Rwanda. The African economy has shown some trends of performance, even if at a very slow pace, especially when compared to other regions of the world. African mechanisms for conflict resolutions are being further tested, even where the would seem to be failing, like in Côte d'Ivoire. A new crop of leaders is emerging that looks set to perform better than its predecessors. Boni Yayi in Benin Republic, Koroma in Sierra Leone, and now possibly Raila Odinga in Kenya. Even so, our feel-good sense must again be tempered by the fact that many of the standing embarrassments that we have all over the continent today, pretending to be leaders, actually started as good people that gave us hope some years back. I recall as a very young undergraduate in 1980 when Robert Mugabe got elected as the president of Zimbabwe. We widely celebrated this, and we thought the renaissance for Africa had become. But more than 20 years on, and at age 84, the young Mugabe is still coasting on, pretending to be leading a 21st century country on the African continent. In answer to the question, what is to be done, therefore, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it behoves us to identify what I call the minimum requirement to turn around the fortunes of governance through the path of democracy. Of critical importance are regular elections that must be consequential. A vibrant civil society must emerge to robustly engage the state. A broader base must be created for governance by ensuring the full participation of civil society in governance processes across the continent. A more decentralized structure of governance must be created to reduce alienation and provide critical support base for the system. These are the nature of the challenges we face today as Africans, and especially as African scholars. They are the type of issues I expect us to begin to interrogate as this all-important conference kicks off. There is need for a global regime of support to Africa, a continent that may no longer be in a position to help itself on some of these very crucial issues. Africa requires better trade and investment conditions, including debt cancellation, to stop what tongue-tied aptly calls a reverse transfer of resources to creditors. There must be an international regime of pressure on TNCs to embrace best practices. Above all, we must seek for an international framework on tenure limitation as a component of democratic governance in Africa. I'm thinking of a situation in which it will become a standard practice that no leader in Africa spends more than 8 years. I believe you me, that would take away a lot of the problems and the challenges the African continent faces today. Again, on some of these issues, I'm persuaded that Africa has lost the capacity to help itself, and it may require some international regime of support to be able to drive in the right direction. No doubt the international system is much more expansive in scope and much more complex in operation than it had ever been. There's an emergent power shift underway in the world of development assistance, side by side with huge corporate players that have become very difficult to control by individual states. Poverty and inequality in access to resources have continued to grow, with no fewer than 89 million fresh people in 43 countries worldwide heading into extreme poverty as a direct result of the current global economic crisis. There's a new wave of terror and the war against it that has defined most completely the orientation of several states and regions across the world since 9/11. The challenge to the environment has never been more enormous, as demonstrated by the recent tsunami in Japan. As well, the proliferation of small arms, which have killed more than 2 million people, mostly in Africa since 1990, continues to pose enormous challenges to the stability of the international system. Massive waves of migration across borders throw up new realities that call for greater initiative. The technology of communication has now so much advanced that every governance issue is now laid bare on the public domain. The unpretentious deployment of cable television and the internet to define the extent and the nature of the global agenda in the Middle East and North Africa currently ongoing is a demonstration of the power of communication and the vulnerability of Africa to what, to all intents and purposes, has taken the shape of imperialism of information. If, in spite of all of these, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, all of these new realities of the new international system, and several other anthropological, health, and wide-ranging cultural issues before Africa, it does seem that I have tended to focus more pointedly on leadership and governance forms in this address. It is because I'm persuaded that except good governance is mainstreamed in Africa, there's hardly any chance of getting any of its more elaborate challenges tackled. And without doubt, there's no chance of credible performance for the continent in the global system. How to facilitate this while examining the place of Africa in the global system, therefore, in my opinion, my humble opinion, constitutes a critical subject that we must interrogate at this conference. And a high level of objectivity that is the hallmark of scientific research is called for here. The issues involved are too important to allow a search for answers and solutions to be paralyzed by some sense of inferiority complex on the part of Africans and Africanists. If it was in order for people to massively exploit Africa for centuries, if it is in order for countries to still continue to hover around Africa in search of resources as vultures over carcass, it is the duty of Africa to take what it must in the global system to get to its destination. And that is the dawn of good governance, engendered by a modern, functioning, and responsive state system. It is then and only then that Africa can begin to earn some respect as a player in the global system. I want to thank everybody for listening to me. Good evening.
Well, I have to apologize that we couldn't change the system. I did not know what went wrong, and we spent some time trying to project the lecture, but we were able to video record it, and we'll be podcasting it. We have to take some questions, and it's in your best interest to post questions. So what I told them is, it is when you ask the first question that they will go where we park the van, and it takes 10 minutes for them to come. So if you like, ask questions. If you like, don't ask questions and stay still. Jamin Abidogun, please.
Thank you, Mom. Well, my university is a small university that is just about 12 years old. It has a history of some degree of instability, but now it's very stable, and we're focused on turning the university into a leadership development institute. With a focus on producing graduates that are globally competitive. We try to broaden the scope of internationalization by encouraging faculty and students to come from wherever. We also try to improve on the integrity of our academic offerings, just to ensure that in our own little space, and that's the way we put it back home in Nigeria, that we want to ensure that in our own little space, 820 hectares of land with about 10,000 members of the community, we want to create a system that works, a system that functions, a system students will come into, and after 4 years or thereabout, they will go out to be better Nigerians, potential leaders of their communities. And that's why we emphasize things like entrepreneurship development. We emphasize subjects and programs that broaden the liberal scope of the education that the students receive. And with all sense of modesty, I can say that we've been achieving some results. You may want to check our website for more information, www.adekunleajasiuniversity.edu.ng. Educational institutions. Yeah, I made the point, for me, the major challenge we have on the continent is the quality of leadership. There's no question about that. I do not subscribe to that perspective that says the fellowship is also as guilty, because I believe, like Chaucer said several years ago, that if gold rust, what will iron do? If the leadership is not capable, if the leadership is convoluted in its perspective, you hardly will find a followership that is appropriately focused. And that's why I made the point about the need for us to do something about the quality of leadership. And for me, I'm not an idealist. I'm not waiting until we have across the continent angels that would be in position of leadership. But I think it will suffice as a short-term measure to ensure that every leader that comes has a set tenure beyond which you cannot go. Because the determination to remain in power in perpetuity is actually the critical trigger factor for corruption, for exclusion, over centralization of power and governance structures and what have you. And that is why, even on the part of UNESCO, a lot is being done to get African universities to be involved in things like the new partnership for development, to provide intellectual platform for a new leadership in Africa. How far we have succeeded in that is still difficult to determine, especially in the context in which you have the brain drain. As African kids are getting out of school, it's an elite capture framework that is picking them from all over the continent. So it's a complex challenge. I don't know if I have answered your question. Thank you very much. The international community has a role to play. And that's why I spoke in terms of an international regime of help to Africa, not to do everything, but at least to ensure that there is the sanctity of established constitutional tenures is maintained. My position is, if you have that, a lot of the corruption that is going on, a lot of the killings, a lot of the exclusion that is going on, there won't be any basis for that anymore. That's number one. Number two, I made the point that as bad as things are, you still have on the continent some emergent leaders that would seem to be doing well. And the ready example that I cited is Boniyayi of Benin Republic. But I also made the point that it's not about to begin to celebrate these people. Because the celebration we had 20, 30 years ago for some of the so-called leaders turned out to be precipitated. We need to find a way to build support for such leaders at all levels, at the level of the African diaspora, at the level of popular structures, the civil society on the African continent, hoping that with all of this going on, we'll be able to throw up these leaders as examples of, and that's why I have a lot of respect for the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. I think for 2 consecutive years now, he didn't find anybody qualified to be given a prize for responsible leadership. Some don't agree with that, but I am absolutely in support of that. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Absolutely. I mean, there's no question about that. The example of Egypt that you cited would seem to me to be a perfect one. But for the democratization of information, that type of thing wouldn't have happened. You couldn't imagine that happening in the Arab world 20 years ago. The domino effect of what happened in Tunisia, the way it broadcast all over the world, brought into the sitting rooms and laptop and iPads of everybody, of course, act as a propellant. And that is why the cameras keep moving from one country to another. It's a sequence from Tunisia to Egypt. When Egypt fell, it went to Liberia, to Libya. Now it's Yemen and Syria. I don't know what will happen when it gets to Saudi Arabia. That's thank you very much. We must get some issues, very clearly. And I made the point. Whether we like it or not, Africa today has marginalized status. And that is not unexpected. A continent that has not been able to solve some of these most fundamental challenges, that is unstable, you don't lose anything by not consulting with Africa. That's the truth. It's painful, but that's the truth. Nobody loses anything. We're talking of the Maghreb, we're talking of the Middle East. There's a major economic factor. So it's not a surprise that the African Union was not consulted, because it has not also demonstrated that there is some structures that deserve to be. Look at the peer review mechanism. Where has it worked? It didn't work in Zimbabwe. In spite of what became glaring to everybody, that it was time for somebody to be asked to leave. African leaders couldn't come up to make that very incisive intervention. Look at what is happening in Côte d'Ivoire. The unfortunate situation in Côte d'Ivoire now is because we are not moving in that as quickly as possible, and then the spread effect will be all over the West African sub-region. These are very unfortunate things, and that's why we must find a way to get support for Africa on these issues. Thank you very much.